We'll call 20 CR 1358, People versus Leticia Stauchs. Record should reflect the jury's not present. Okay. Okay. Jury's not present in the courtroom. Is there anything we need to take up outside the presence of the jury at this point in time? Prosecution?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
And you're good to go?
Yes.
Is your feet going to be prosecution table?
Yes.
Okay. Defense, are you ready to go? And you're going to use his same feed?
I'm going to use the podium.
Podium? Okay. All right. All right. Let's go ahead and bring the jury in. Please. Thank you. You may all be seated. Court will recall 20 CR 1358, People versus Leticia Stauchs. Record should reflect the jury has returned to the courtroom. At this point in time, we will start with the prosecution's closing argument. Prosecution?
Thanks, Judge. Morning. Been on trial. You guys have sat through a lot of evidence, and you're going to have to sift through that evidence and sift through the instructions, kind of what we talked about when we're selecting you, and apply the facts of this case to the law that you now have been given. Before I start my closing, I want to just say thank you for that. You guys have been very attentive. I can see that every day. You've asked some very good questions that I'm actually going to use in my closing argument as I go forward here. One of the things about a homicide case that is true and to form in pretty much every homicide case I've done in my career is the case kind of evolves to talk about the defendant. We spend a lot of time talking about the defendant. And then when you add that the defense is insanity, you even spend more time talking about the defendant. I want to come back to Gannon in a little bit. Gannon's been in a box back here for the whole trial. This is what the trial should be about. And I'm not doing this to get sympathy from you. I'm doing this to tell you that what Gannon had to tell you in this trial through the autopsy, all you need to know. And when the defendant did what she did to him, saying at the time she did it, not only do we know how he was killed and the effort and determination it took to kill him, we also know that his body was found in Florida. Body wasn't found in Florida. Do you think we'd be talking about insanity in this trial? It's a pure fact of divine intervention that Macon Ponder happened to be searching that bridge when he did. Remember, he said he searched that bridge every 2 years. Just so happened on March 17th, 2020, out there searching that bridge and he saw that suitcase. Dr. Lewis says it was crazy to drive a suitcase across the country and dump it over a bridge in Florida. Was it really? Think about the divine intervention of Gannon's body even being found to get here to where we're at right now. And the effort and determination that she took to hide his body. We're going to talk about that quite a bit more as I go through my closing. What I'd like to do now is talk about the autopsy and his injuries. I'm not going to show you any pictures. I'm going to tell you that right up front. I'm going to use the diagram. I wonder if we can have the TVs turned on. I can start with that. To describe his injuries, because his injuries are relevant. They're not only relevant to the crimes that she's charged with, the murder counts, but they're relevant to what her state of mind was when she committed those crimes. And so what we have up on the board now is People's Exhibit 144. You heard Dr. Ignacio testify. We showed you pictures of each and every injury that Gannon had to his body. This first diagram in People's Exhibit 144 kind of depicts the stab wounds. It also depicts the gunshot wound to his left chin area. Now, at least the group that I talked to in jury selection, we talked about every day of your life, you were training to be jurors. That means you're using your common sense to make decisions, just like you're going to have to today when you go back to the deliberation room. Just by looking at these injuries, what does your common sense tell you? Without Dr. Ignacio's testimony, Gannon was defending himself. He was fighting off. Despite having hydrocodone in his system. Made him lethargic. He somehow was able to fight her off. The injuries to his fingers, the injuries to his arms. 18 times. 18 times. She took a knife. Stabbed him. The locations of the stab wounds. What does that tell you? Use your common sense. It's not psychotic. It's strategic. The stab wounds are to the chest. As Gannon's fighting, the stab wounds are to his back. But it's not just stab wounds. You know that. He has to use judgment and reflection to get another weapon. What that weapon was, who knows? But she got a weapon and hit him in the skull 4 separate times. Go to the next diagram. I forgot to mention the strategic stab wound to his neck just underneath his ear, which we see in People's Exhibit 145. The diagram doesn't do justice to the skull fracture that she caused to him. And I'm not going to show you pictures, but I think, remember those pictures? Completely obliterated the skull. The amount of force it takes to do that, judgment, reflection. The next exhibit shows the injuries that he had to the top of his head. 4 separate strikes to his head. Wasn't good enough. Wasn't good enough for her. So, judgment and reflection, she goes and gets a handgun. She fires that handgun 3 times. I don't know how those bullets stayed in the pillow. We can rack our brain for ages. I don't know how those bullets stayed in that pillow. I don't know that we'll ever know how those bullets stayed in that pillow. What matters is the bullet that went into Gannon. That bullet matched the gun she used that was still in the house. He attributed to Quincy Brown using, or Eduardo using, whatever story of the day it was. Judgment, reflection, location of gunshot wound. Let's talk about make and ponder a little bit. Because as she drives to Florida, she checks in at about 12:22 in the morning, just after midnight, Candlewood Suites, Pensacola, Florida. Why do they drive all the way from Decatur in one night to get to Florida? Why does she want to get rid of Gannon's body in Florida? Gulf of Mexico. You drive this bridge at night, as Make and Ponder testified to, there's no lights on it. We know that sometime between, probably between 4 in the morning to 5 in the morning, she's out there. Look at the location where the body was found with the red arrow on People's Exhibit 63. More importantly, look at the space that she has to park this vehicle. I don't know where the pointer is, but you
Right
see,
behind you. It's right there on the window.
okay. Thanks. You can see the shoulder here, and there's plenty of room. Why does she park there? Because she can. 4 in the morning, there's no traffic out there. Does she think there's water underneath the bridge? Is that illogical thinking as you're crossing a bridge and you can't see anything? You cross a main waterway, the Escambia River, and you continue going until you find a place to stop. She probably had to wait that there was no traffic. It's with the body. Did you ever think the body was going to be found again? We go to the next slide. You see the suitcase underneath the bridge. And as Macon Ponder testified, it was where he and his coworker found it. It was clearly someone who dropped it directly over the bridge. There was an imprint that you remember seeing pictures of, and they ended up dragging it under the bridge, not knowing what the contents were. More importantly, not smelling anything. Why is that important? Harley didn't smell anything. The body had been out here since February 4th. This is now March 17th in the Florida heat. They didn't smell anything until the suitcase was open. That lends some credibility to Harley when she says she never smelled or never knew the suitcase was back in the back of the van. Anyway, they dump it out and they see that probably the most horrific thing anybody can ever see in their lives: scan his body in a fetal position, decomposed, wearing the same clothes that he was wearing January 7th, 2020. She killed him. Pants and a white stripe. Watch the video when they leave. See him wearing sweatpants with a white stripe. Talk about that more later. Let's talk about the law, okay? And as I go through the law, I'm going to later kind of go through the timeline of events. And I would like you to think about the mental states and sanity as I talk about those. So I want to talk about the law first. The first instruction I have up here is the elements of the crime of murder in the first degree after deliberation. You will see that most of these elements are not in dispute. That the defendant, not in dispute. In the state of Colorado, at or about the date and place charged, not in dispute. After deliberation and with intent, those are highlighted because those are the culpable mental states that are attached to that crime. Those are the culpable mental states in the insanity definition that we're talking about. So I want to highlight those in a second. To cause the death of a person other than herself, cause the death of a person again. Those are not in dispute either. And number 7 is the issue in the case. That's the insanity defense. I'm going to talk about in a minute. We can go to the next elements. After deliberation, not only intentionally, but also that the decision to commit the act has been made after the exercise of reflection and judgment concerning the act. An act committed after deliberation is never one which has been committed in a hasty or impulsive manner. Now, some of you, before you came into court, if you've never seen this definition, you're probably thinking about premeditation, where people are planning something out and it takes days to plan out the murder and then they finally do the murder. That's not what that definition says. It's just enough time to have judgment and reflection, to make decisions. To go from grabbing a knife, to go to grabbing some blunt force object, to go to grabbing. She exercising judgment and reflection. And it doesn't have to be good judgment. It doesn't have to be bad judgment. It just has to be judgment. Is she making a decision? A person acts intentionally or with intent when her conscious objective is to cause a specific result prescribed by the statute defining the offense. It is immaterial whether or not the result actually occurred. I don't want to bet money on it, but I bet you a lawyer wrote that definition. It just means with intent. What was their intent? Did she intend to kill Gannon when she did what she did to Gannon? I would suggest that that's not in dispute either. We can now go to the next crime, which is murder in the first degree, a child under the age of 12, and the defendant was in a position of trust. Now, the reason why there's 2 counts of murder, there's only 1 victim, is because this is just another theory of first-degree murder. There's several theories of first-degree murder in the law. These are the 2 that are in front of you now, okay? And as you can see, the mental state is what's different, and the age of the victim. And then the defendant has to be in a possession of trust. That's not in dispute. She's stepmom. She's obviously acting as Gannon's parent at the time that she... But let's talk about what knowingly is, because that's the culpable mental state with this crime. Person acts knowingly or willfully with respect to conduct or to circumstance described by statute defining an offense when she is aware that her conduct is of such a nature or that such a circumstance exists. A person acts knowingly or willfully with respect to a result of her conduct when she is aware that her conduct is practically certain to cause the result. Stab someone 18 times, hit him over the head 4 times. When you shoot at him 3 times, striking him once, I think you might have an idea of what the result might be. I would suggest that that's not in dispute in this case. But let's go to insanity. These words mean a lot. This is not something that you're going to find in the DSM-5. This is not a mental illness. This is a legal definition. These are just like the elements of the crime that we just went through. The reason I say that is because, first of all, I'm going to start at the bottom. It says the law presumes everyone to be sane. There's a presumption of sanity. However, after some evidence of insanity has been presented, the burden of proof shifts to us, and we gladly accept it. Gladly accept it. Now, what does insanity mean? The defendant was insane at the time of the commission of the acts if he was so diseased or defective in mind at the time of the commission of the act as to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong with respect to the act. That's why you heard me ask that question so many times. Or she suffered from a condition of mind caused by a mental disease or defect that prevented her from forming a culpable mental state, the ones we just talked about, that is an essential element of a crime charged. And then the next paragraph means something. Because it says, but care should be taken not to confuse mental disease or defect with moral obliquity, mental depravity, or passion growing out of anger. Passion growing out of anger. If you lose your temper, you don't get to claim insanity. Revenge, hatred, or other motives and kindred evil conditions, because when an act is induced by any of these causes, the person is accountable to the law. So you can't lose your temper and come in and say, I lost my temper, I wasn't myself. We're humans. We have emotions. The next part is what's critical. It says, in addition, disease or defective in mind does not refer to an abnormality manifested by only repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. We heard a little bit about antisocial personality disorder. Who hasn't been diagnosed with that? But that's the reason why someone who has antisocial personality disorder, they have fun killing people. They lie all the time. They manipulate all the time. They have no empathy. They have no sympathy. Those people don't get to come in and say, I was literally insane. Now, what does mental disease or defect mean? This is what the legal definition of mental disease or defect is. And I'm going to leave this up here for quite a while because I'm going to go through all the doctor's testimony here in a second. And I want you to look at that instruction as we talk about what they had to say. But first of all, It has to be a severe word means something. It has to be a severely abnormal mental condition that grossly and demonstrably impairs a person's perception of understanding of reality and that are not attributable to the voluntary ingestion of alcohol or drugs. Mental disease or defect does not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or other antisocial behavior. So let's talk about that. The word, grossly and demonstrably. You think Harley might notice if she had a grossly and demonstrably mental condition? You think she might have shared that with you? You think Al Stauch might have noticed when it says it has to be grossly and demonstrably? It's got to demonstrate it, right? It's not something you snap your fingers and then all of a sudden go into a different personality. How about her brother? Howard. Think he might have noticed it? Let's talk about the doctors. I'm actually going to talk about Dr. Niederhauser first. Dr. Niederhauser was really the first doctor and all the doctors you heard from to see her. If you recall, she saw her on December 5th, December 13th, 30 minutes each time. Came in and remember the difference between a clinical evaluation and a forensic evaluation? Clinical evaluation. I rely on what the patient says. I rely, just like if they came in and said, I've got a fever, I'm going to take that at their word and I'm going to treat them for what they're telling me. She comes in and says, I've got anxiety. Treats her for anxiety. She diagnoses her with general anxiety. And she told you on the stand that she had general anxiety at the time she's testimony. A lot of people did that came in and testified. That's not a severe and abnormal mental condition that grossly and demonstrably impairs a person's perception or understanding of reality. We all experience that. In fact, you got to experience her experiencing it on video. In January 29th, 2020, when she's being interviewed, remember at the end of the interview, she had to call the paramedics and she said she was suffering from panic attacks. The paramedics came in and said, your vital signs are not only good, they're exceptionally good. You're breathing fine. Your heart rate's fine. I don't know what the problem is. I think she might have been faking that to get out of the setting. Dr. Niederhauser also tells us that she had no history of inpatient psychiatric treatment, no history other than anxiety of any other diagnosis for mental illnesses. And this is based on what the defendant's telling her. No evidence of psychosis. No reason to put her on an M1 hold. If she was experiencing psychosis in December of 2019, the doctor would have had an obligation to commit her. That's the kind of stuff that talks about severely abnormal mental conditions that affects your vision of reality. It's not there. The other thing about that visit, the timing of that visit, December of 2019. Remember, the whole purpose of that visit is so that she can get a letter to go to her employment because she didn't want to work anymore. The ironic part about it is at the second interview, the defendant tells her, I don't want to work there anymore. But I got a contract, so I need a letter to get out of it. But what else happens right before Gannon is murdered? Goes on a cruise. Goes on a cruise in January. You think that might have something to do with not wanting to go to work based on what you know about her and the statements she's made? Dr. Moore, Christine Moore, she works at the jail. She's a psychologist. She evaluates people who come in who are charged with serious crimes, perhaps their first time in a jail. They evaluate to see if they're a danger to themselves or others. It's a psychological evaluation. She said it was a clinical evaluation. They also want to know if there's any medication they might need.
You don't want that. You prove that with that rope right there.
What the defendant tells her is that she has anxiety. I didn't do the crime. Not going to be a problem. That was on March 5th, 2020, first day of her visit in the jail. Dr. Moore spent quite a bit of time with her up until January 5th of 2021, seeing her either once every 2 weeks or once every week, depending on what was going on with her. March 20th, she goes to her and says, I just want to see how you're doing. And his body was found ever in Florida. The reason why I'm telling you this is because she doesn't say, hey, Maria Sanchez did it. Or, you know what? I got dissociative identity disorder. You're a psychologist. I need help. Nothing. In fact, she told you there was no evidence during the entire time she spent with her that she had dissociative identity disorder or any other severe mental illness that meets that definition. This was it was a little over a month after the crime, January 27th, March 5th. And then what happens on June 5th, 2020 in the jail? You recall Dr. Moore's testimony. She reviews all the deputies' notes to see what's going on with the defendant at the time, to see how she's doing. And she reviews notes from deputies that say, I'm going to start acting crazy. That's what the defendant says. And then on that very day, June 5th, 2020, she enters a competency issue into the court. That's how we get to the competency evaluations that I'm going to talk about here in a second. The timing of that. Okay, Gannon's body was found on March 17th. She finds out about it on March 20th. You know that she's read the discovery, the police reports in this case, and there's nothing wrong with that. She's entitled to read that. Point is, she's read it. And then all of a sudden, I'm going to start acting crazy. For another defense, no dissociative identity disorder, certainly no Maria Sanchez during her entire visits with Dr. Moore for that year period of time. The first competency evaluation was done down at the state hospital. We don't pick where she goes. The prosecution, when I say we don't pick what doctors do the evaluation. Court orders it, goes to the state hospital. Doctors are chosen, they do an evaluation. What's relevant about this first competency evaluation that takes place on July 20th, 2020 is when she goes to the state hospital, is that they have a 2-week observation period. Her nurses, employees are watching her. He actually goes to a nurse and says, can you tell when someone's faking it? Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray actually they do a forensic interview with her on August 4th of 2020. Again, now we're in a forensic mode. Now we're not just going to listen to what she has to say. We're going to look at collateral information. We're going to call Al Stauch. We're going to try to call Harley. We're going to try to call family members to see if we can corroborate what she's telling us. So what does she tell them? I've got bipolar disorder. I'm a manic depressant. I ramble. I'm a manic depression. That's my mental illness. Nothing about dissociative identity disorder, which according to Dr. Lewis, she's had it since a very young age. Nothing about Maria Sanchez. Remember Dr. Torres' testimony when she was talking about the competency evaluation? One of the psychological tests that she took had a question about multi-personalities. And the answer led Dr. Torres to ask her, hey, do you have multiple personalities? This is August 4th, 2020. Dr. Gray and Dr. Torres diagnosed her with specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features. Talked about that a little bit. Now, does it meet that definition? How do we know if it meets that definition? Her actions. How other people perceive her. Also, Dr. Torres said you, no, it's not a severe mental disease. It's not something that affects her everyday life, that affects her ability to make decisions. No evidence of psychosis during that evaluation either. No history of inpatient treatment during that evaluation. Psychological testing. MMPI-2. Remember that test? What does that test tell you and told Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray? That she exaggerates psychiatric symptoms to the point where even people who are hospitalized for their mental illness don't answer questions that way. You think she might be faking it? Now we go to the second competency evaluation with Dr. Grimmett. Now, remember how Dr. Grimmett became involved in this case? The defense at the time, and it wasn't these defense attorneys, requested that she do the evaluation of the second competency evaluation. We had nothing to do with that. So, now this happens on December 22nd, 2020. That's when Dr. Grimmett talks to her. And so I want you to think about how it's progressed now. Now, she starts talking about dissociative identity disorder and bipolar disorder. When I say she, the defendant. That's what the defendant is telling Dr. Grimmett. She says she has 4 distinct personalities. None of those 4 were Maria Sanchez. Remember what Dr. Grimmett testified to? That she was, first of all, creating these names. Second of all, like Jasmine was a Disney character. Talked about vampires. Twilight. I've seen the movie Twilight. I know I hate admitting that, but I've seen it. And she cited the characters from that movie. And Dr. Grimmett said, wait a minute here. You're just telling me characters from a movie? That's not dissociative identity disorder. But she evaluated her for it because that's what she's telling. Dr. Grimmett evaluated her for DID. Said, no, not there. I don't even need any more information. I don't need to rule it out. Not there. She also diagnosed the defendant with other specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features. She also told you that it doesn't fit that definition. Jump forward to February of 2022. I don't know when the conversation took place, but at some point before the defendant pled not guilty by reason of insanity on February 11th, 2022, they had a conversation, the counsel had a conversation with Dr. Lewis. Remember Dr. Lewis testified that I recommended you change your plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. Why is that important? Why did I ask her about that? I think that put a little pressure on her. And she says, I recommend you plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and I'll do the evaluation. Why didn't she do the evaluation right away? Why'd she wait till November? Come out and talk to the defendant. Needless to say, when she pled not guilty by reason of insanity in February, the same process happened as happened when she raised competency. Sent down to the state hospital. The state hospital chooses who's going to do the evaluation. They make a decision on who already knows the case. Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray already read all the discovery in this case. They knew the facts of the case. They knew the defendant. But they're doing a different evaluation. As you remember, competency goes to her state of mind at the time they're doing the evaluation. What's her understanding, what's happening in the courtroom, whether or not she can get along with her attorneys, that kind of thing. Insanity is completely different. Insanity, you got to go back, just like the law says, at the time of the crime, what was her mental state? So that's a much broader evaluation. You got to look at everything. So Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray, they also reach out again, call out. They attempt to talk to Harley, family members, to see what's going on with her. But what is the defendant saying now? Gone off of bipolar now. And now she's created more personalities as part of this dissociative identity disorder. Is it just a coincidence that she's consulted with Dr. Lewis prior to all this? Now Maria Sanchez comes into play during this evaluation. Dr. Torres testified, and it's in a report, that she said, there is no credible evidence to conclude she has a condition that conforms to the definition of a mental disease or defect. Pretty powerful language. That's powerful language. No credible evidence. What's also interesting about this evaluation compared to Dr. Lewis's evaluation is they do two interviews, if you remember. One was in March, one was in June. The March interview, I think I couldn't count how many questions, but it wasn't a lot of questions asked. It was the defendant talking. They just let her go. In June, they asked more questions. One of the questions that Dr. Torres asked is, can we talk to Maria? Can we talk to Maria Sanchez? She said, no, Maria just doesn't come out. There's got to be some kind of stressor, or there's got to be a triggering event, which coincidentally is exactly what the DSM-5 says. I can't just summon Maria. You saw on Wednesday how that happened, and it was magic, according to the Dr. Lewis. No severe abnormal mental conditions that grossly and demonstrably impair a person's perception of understanding of reality. No psychosis. No bipolar. Because remember the first competency evaluation, they said they had to rule it out. They've ruled it out. Bipolar does not exist with this defendant based on Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray. They also said no dissociative identity disorder. Didn't have to rule that out. They had enough to say there's no credible evidence. That's not there. They continued on with the diagnosis of other specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features. Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray came to the conclusion that the defendant was not legally insane at the time of the crime. Let's go to the next slide, which is the credibility instruction. This instruction applies to experts as well. You may believe all the testimony of a witness, part of it, or none of it. This instruction applies to every witness who testifies, including Dr. Lewis. I got highlighted certain words there. Motive. Didn't see motive in the elements of first-degree murder, but you see it here. Money is a strong motivator. Having shows on HBO, strong motivator. Having your son videotape evaluations on a first-degree murder case that's gotten quite a bit of publicity, or perhaps another documentary, is motive. You're gonna do a documentary if she says she's saying, sorry, did what I could. Acting. Not as good as, well, not as bad as Robert De Niro, I guess she would say. But she's acting. You also have to look at her demeanor and manner while testifying. She wouldn't answer any of my questions. She wouldn't answer my questions. Because she didn't want you to know the answers. She wanted you to know what she wanted to say. She shows up to court late. Talk about narcissistic tendencies. Manner while testifying. I think that speaks for itself, how she testified. Especially when you compare Dr. Torres. Obviously, she would disagree with my questions. Remember how many times she says it depends to me? She's not our expert. This happens to be the expert that the state hospital chose to come in to do a neutral evaluation. The truth. Dr. Lewis. She didn't know the legal definition of insanity in the state of Colorado, ladies and gentlemen. The whole reason she came in to testify